Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a recent book by Shaul Bakhash entitled The Fall of Rضاشاه, The Abdication, Exile, and Death of Modern Iran's Founder, published this year by I.B. Tauris. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, this seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays, in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, since pandemic restrictions in the virtual realm. And today's session, I should note, is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank our two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as any number of anonymous donors. We invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. If you're interested in purchasing the book, information will appear in the chat function. There is a discount code that you can use. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask that those with questions use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted in the chat function as well. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Marissa Korma, the director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program, who will introduce today's speaker. Marissa, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this very warm welcome and introduction. I'm truly delighted to be part of this book discussion as director of the Middle East program with our colleagues from the History and Public Policy program, and particularly honored to introduce our esteemed author, Shaul Bakhash. Dr. Bakhash is the Clarence Robinson Professor of History Emeritus at George Mason University. He's received his BA and MA from Harvard University and his doctorate from Oxford University. He's worked for many years as a journalist in Iran and for the London Times, the Financial Times, and The Economist. And he's author of many books on Iran, including Iran, Monarchy, Bureaucracy, and Reform under the Qajars, The Politics of Oil and Revolution in Iran, and Reign of the Ayatollahs, Iran and the Islamic Revolution. And has, of course, published numerous articles in various journals and newspapers. And I think most importantly for us at the Wilson Center is a former Wilson Center scholar. So welcome, Shaul, and congratulations on your new book, which I'm going to show off right here, from which I learned a lot about the founder of modern Iran and his riveting story of abdication and exile. There are so many relevant themes that emerge that are very relevant to the politics of the region today, particularly with regards to great power competition. But I will leave all of this to perhaps the Q&A session, and we will have, after your presentation, an opportunity to hear from two distinguished discussants, Ervind Abrahamian and Janet Afari, who will delve into their commentary after your presentation. So just a few words about our distinguished commentators. Dr. Abrahamian was Distinguished Professor of History at the City University of New York and is now Professor Emeritus of History at Baruch College and the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. He's also author of a number of books on Iran. And Dr. Janet Afari, who holds the Millicham Chair on Religion, Global Religion and Modernity at the University of California, Santa Barbara, is a professor of religious studies, also an author of a number of books on Iran. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being part of this discussion. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Shaul Bakhash to present his book and share this fascinating story with our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Rضاشاه seized power in Iran in 1921, and for the next 20 years, he dominated Iran. And with the assistance of very able advisors, he transformed it. His reign, his considerable achievements, as well as his failures, have been written about extensively. My book covers largely fresh ground and focuses on the events in 1941 that led to the abrupt end of his rule, to his abdication, his exile, his life in exile, and his always prickly relations with the British who controlled him in this period. When World War II broke out, Rضاشاه declared Iran's neutrality. He wanted to protect Iran from the ravages of the war, and he also wanted to prevent any disruption of his extensive economic programs, which relied on trade with belligerents on both sides of the conflict, with Great Britain, with Germany, with the Soviet Union, and with other countries. Yet in August 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Iran. The stated reason was the risk posed to the Allies by the large German presence in Iran. But a second, unstated, but weightier and more pressing reason was that when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in July 1941, access to the route from the Persian Gulf across Iran to the Soviet Union to supply a Russia hard pressed by Hitler's armies with military material and other supplies became crucial. And of course, use of this route was incompatible with Iran's neutrality, hence the invasion. And then, having occupied Iran and requiring full access to Iran's communication systems, ports, railways, roads, airports, ports, and believing that Rضاشاه would not cooperate or would not obstruct or would obstruct full cooperation with the Allies, the British engineered Rضاشah's abdication. It is fair to say, as I spell out in my book in some detail, how the British did this. But I think it fair to say that both his abdication and his departure from the country was compelled, not voluntary. How can we characterize Rضاشah's 3 years in exile? For one thing, the once feared and formidable ruler, whose ferocious temper could leave his ministers quaking with fear, had grown decidedly less imperious. His country had been invaded and occupied. He had been forced to abdicate. He was now leaving the country to which he has devoted so much attention. Something in the man had broken. His daughters saw before them a stooped, suddenly aged man. He was no longer given to his ferocious fits of temper. For the first time in anyone's memory, he complained that he felt tired. For the first time, members of his family saw tears in his eyes. He became dismissive of the trappings of royalty that had surrounded him. Still on Iranian soil, he told a former minister who came to see him on official business, but feared incurring his anger, "Don't be afraid, I don't count for anything anymore." In exile, and later in Mauritius, where the British took him, and later in Johannesburg, where they permitted him to relocate, Reza Shah was no longer a free man. The British, of course, determined his place and the conditions of his exile. They decided how much freedom to allow him or members of his family. They censored his mail. They decided if he could receive visitors from Iran, or if any member of his family or his household could leave Mauritius and later Johannesburg. The guidelines issued by the Foreign Office to the governor of Mauritius, Bede Clifford, governed Reza Shah's, or the British handling of Reza Shah in exile until the end of his reign. Governor Clifford was told that Reza Shah should in no way be treated as a prisoner, and every effort should be made to make him feel comfortable. However, should he or any member of his family attempt to cause trouble, then the governor was free to restrict their movements in any way he thought appropriate and to take other firm actions. Though safely out of reach, once in exile, the British continued to worry that Reza Shah would become the target of German or enemy intrigue or engage in intrigue himself. All these concerns proved groundless. In Mauritius and later in Johannesburg, Reza Shah displayed no interest in engaging in intrigue. In Mauritius, he even disapproved of family members mixing with the Europeans. All he wanted was to be left alone. In his 7 months on the island of Mauritius, he did not even leave his house and its compound, restricting himself to walking in its gardens. "I am a prisoner," he told his son-in-law, "and must behave like one." Mauritius was hardly an unattractive place, yet Reza Shah intensely disliked it. He felt confined on an island surrounded by water. The wet, damp climate did not suit him. He yearned, he said, for the cool, bracing climate of the Iranian uplands. He complained that he slept badly at night. Visibly despondent, he avoided contact with anyone outside his immediate family. When Governor Clifford, at tea after Reza Shah had been settled in Mauritius, asked him if he was comfortable, if he was receiving all the attention he required, Reza Shah replied, "What shall I say? We are prisoners. We are used to the broad open spaces and the mountains. To us, this existence is like a death in life." Once he abdicated, and while still on Iranian soil, Reza Shah also exchanged the military uniform he had always worn, even as king, for civilian clothes. He hated wearing civilian suits, but somehow he decided, no longer king or commander of an army, he did not deserve to be in military uniform. In Mauritius, his son-in-law pointed out that Napoleon had worn his military uniform even in exile on the island of St. Helena, but to no avail. As was his lifetime habit, he established for himself a routine to which he strictly adhered, down to the time he had his first cigarette, his mid-morning tea, his afternoon tea, or his meals. As always, he rose early, usually at 5 a.m., and had his breakfast alone. He then walked for a solid 2 hours. After lunch with his family, he walked again, and again in the evening. Governor Clifford and his aides regarded this walking as, quote, vigorous exercise and somehow as inappropriate. From the moment he arrived in Mauritius, Rضاشاه pressed to go elsewhere, to Canada, to America, to South Africa, to Argentina. The British were not sympathetic. A move involved considerable expense, extensive arrangements, finding transport for a large family in a time of war, and securing the agreement of officials somewhere else in the empire to accept Rضاشاه. However, there were other considerations. Governor Clifford in Mauritius was anxious lest Rضاشاه grow more despondent and that his health deteriorate if he were kept on the island against his will. And in Tehran, the Shah was pressing his father's case, and the allies needed the ruling Shah's cooperation for their operations in Iran. After a lot of coming and going or talking, Eden, the foreign secretary, eventually decided to allow Rضاشاه to relocate. And in this way, he ended up spending the last 2 years of his life in Johannesburg in South Africa. In Johannesburg, Rضاشاه felt more content than he had felt in Mauritius, even if he did not remain content for long. The climate suited him well and was closer to that of the Iranian uplands, which he loved. Here, he ventured out often, and he took his walks in the city streets themselves. At 65, Rضاشاه had never seen a modern European country, the kind of country he hoped Iran would become. Now he was struck to see European-style countries in Africa. He was impressed by the multi-story buildings, the cleanliness of the streets, the orderliness of people getting in and out of trains and going about their business. He was particularly impressed by the large presence of women in the public space, dressed, as he put it, in men's clothes and driving taxis and even trucks. He was surprised to learn that the grocer and the washerwoman who came to his house were driving their own cars. In Johannesburg, the isolation he felt while in Mauritius was relieved by his ability to have visits from family at home. And when they came, he eagerly read the letters and the newspapers they brought with him, hungry as always for news from Iran. When his daughter, Princess Ashraf, arrived in 1944 to be with her father briefly, he peppered her with questions about his son and how he was doing as king. In Mauritius, in Johannesburg, he continued the practice he had started in Mauritius of listening every evening to the Persian news broadcasts of the BBC and Radio Berlin and Radio Tehran too, whenever it could be accessed. When Rضاشاه decided to take up residence in Johannesburg, British officials feared that the South African color bar would prove problematic or lead to embarrassing moments. As W.H. Young at the Foreign Office noted, quote, The ex-Shah's party are bound to have uncomfortable moments. Unfortunately, they are a rather dark-skinned race. As it turned out, these fears were not borne out. No incidents involving members of the royal family and the color bar were reported to London during the family's South African stay. Another source of concern was that Rضاشاه's 5 sons were also not getting a proper education. The concern for the Shah in Tehran was that he was distressed to learn that his brothers their only entertainment were movies and cabarets, and they were not studying properly. The efforts to arrange for the proper education of the sons I mentioned because it is like a mirror to the loss of moorings, to the dislocation that the royal family experienced in exile. The 3 oldest boys were already beyond school age. The 3 younger ones could not attend the local schools because of the level of their education, the language barrier, and also the color bar. One proposal after another for educating the boys was considered, and then for one reason or another abandoned. A word about Rضاشاه's finances in exile. By the time Rضاشاه and his family boarded ship for exile, the royal family was large. There was the Shah and his wife, 6 sons, 3 daughters, Rضاشah's son-in-law and his private secretary, a cook, and several servants. Before he abdicated, Rضاشاه had been a very wealthy man. As king, he had managed to amass a great deal of land, not always by the most appropriate means, and by some count, he has owned some 2,000 villages or parts of villages across Iran. When he abdicated, there was in his bank account the equivalent at the 1941 exchange rate, 10 million pounds in his bank account. But under British pressure, Rضاشاه turned over all his wealth to his son for the use of the public welfare. He was now going into exile with a party of 19 with no money of his own. He said, quote, I haven't a penny to my name. What am I to do with this hoard? His money problem in exile was resolved by regular transfers from his son, the ruling Shah. Yet it is curious that he continued to worry that he could not then make ends meet and pressed his son for regular money transfers, so that at his death, there remained over 100,000 pounds in his Barclays bank account. Though more content in Johannesburg than he had been in Mauritius, it can hardly be said that Rضاشاه was happy in exile. And in Johannesburg, too, he began to grow inclusively reclusive. His private secretary, Ali Izadi, noted that he avoided people, had grown attuned to being alone, and now rarely ventured down from his room before noon. Marking the advent of Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, in March 1941, a new year which coincides with the spring equinox and which Iranian families traditionally celebrate together as a moment of rebirth, hope, and new beginnings. Rضاشاه seemed to his private secretary more crestfallen than usual. To his daughter Shams in Tehran, he wrote, "My physical condition is not bad, but as to my state of mind, it is better not to speak." Repeatedly, he asked for permission to relocate to a place still in British hands, but nearer home, where members of his family could more easily visit him. He told his sons in March 1944 that he hoped this would be the last year of his life. British officials were unmoved. As the British ambassador in Tehran noted, "As you know, we are anxious that he should remain as far away as possible from Persia." By June 1944, Rضاشاه's physical condition too had visibly deteriorated, and he had grown much weaker. He complained that he felt unwell, but as usual, he refused medication or medical attention. He was now taking his daily walk in his own bedroom, and his private secretary, Izadi, noticed one morning that he could barely manage even this brief pacing. The arrival of his daughter, Princess Shams, in late July boosted his spirits, and on the evening of July 25, with Princess Shams there, he chatted and engaged in the banter he sometimes used with his staff. But early on the morning of July 26, Izadi, the private secretary, was awakened by a loud knocking on his bedroom door. It was Rضاشاه's personal servant, Mahmoud. "His Majesty won't wake up," Mahmoud said. Izadi dressed and hurried to Rضاشاه's side. He appeared to Izadi to be sleeping. Rضاشاه later wrote, "The look on his face was peaceful. There was no sign of death on it. His hand was still warm to Izadi's touch." "How is Your Excellency's health?" Izadi asked. Rضاشاه did not answer. He had passed away. His long, unhappy exile had ended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bakash, for giving us a really good summary of the book and some interesting anecdotes. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Janet Afari for her commentary, and then we'll go to everyone after that. Go ahead, Janet.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I had to move. There's construction in my building. I really enjoyed reading The Fall of Rضاشاه, which showcases Shah al-Bakash's remarkable skills as both a wonderful historian and a terrific journalist of Iran and the Middle East. The book is part diplomatic history, part travelogue, as we follow Rضاشاه and his entourage of Mauritius and South Africa, as we just heard, and part what I can only define as juicy gossip by the British staff who accompanied the royal family on their trip. So let me start with this last observation. The royal family comes across as a totally unruly bunch, except for the young Mohammad Reza Shah, who had now become the king in Iran, and perhaps Ashraf. Shams, the eldest daughter, who had unveiled just 5 years earlier in 1936, is a wild and unhinged princess. She dislikes an expensive sports car. I had to look it up. Sunbeam Talbot in crushed strawberry color, which she was to take on the trip with her. She's introduced by the British officials who accompany Reza Shah as the most selfish and spoiled young woman I have ever met. The Shah's younger brother of the same mother, Ali Reza, was apparently a total menace to the women of Tehran while Reza Shah was in power. Some of the stories reminds us of those we heard about Saddam Hussein's sons and their sexual exploits. The other son seems to have no serious interest in life at all. It all makes you wonder how a stern man like Rضاشاه, who mortified all around him, could have ended up with such unruly children. But the crux of a book is its diplomatic history, especially the years 1940-41. In reading the British accounts of the period, the fall of Rضاشاه shows that while public opinion in Iran was supportive of Germany, and young Iranian officers were also pro-German, Rضاشاه himself was not pro-German, and the British were well aware of this. The British minister in Tehran, Reader Bullard, never suggested that the Shah was pro-German or an admirer of Hitler, nor did anyone else in the British records of the period. In July of 1940, Bullard in fact argued that, quote, it is certain that the Shah's sympathies, were he to express them, would be found to be more in favor of the Allies than of Germany. The book shows that this decision to force Rضاشاه to abdicate and go into exile was therefore not because of Rضاشah's pro-German sympathies, nor an automatic result of the Allies' occupation of Iran. Rather, it came after considerable back and forth among British diplomats and with the Iranian state. Bullard initially wrote to the British Foreign Secretary that they should accommodate the Shah, Rضاشاه, in every possible way, and also keep him on the throne. He and others did everything possible to convince Rضاشاه that the Allies would ultimately win, and that Iran should cut off its considerable economic ties with Germany, a difficult position to argue, since Germany had been the most reliable economic partner of Iran. The fall of Rضاشاه argues that Bullard suddenly altered his approach in the summer of 1941 for two reasons. First, Rضاشاه and his advisors did not fully grasp the life and death issues at stake for England and its allies when the Second World War broke out and as Hitler overran Europe and occupied France. And second, after the German invasion of Russia in July 1941, as Shaul just pointed out, Britain realized that it needed full control over Iranian routes, something that would have been impossible with the Shah in place, so Rضاشاه had to go. The book shows that Bullard relied on Anne Lambton to furnish the rationale for this change in position. Now, Lambton was no ordinary press attaché. She had a PhD from SOAS, was a specialist in medieval and early modern Iranian history, and had a deep knowledge of the history of democracy in the constitutional revolution. Just on an aside, when I wrote my book on the Iranian constitutional revolution, she was really one of the more reliable sources that I worked on in writing my own book. In 1941, it was Lambton who provided the rationale for why the Shah should be removed. And it was related to neither of the two factors I mentioned earlier. In other words, the real reasons for the removal of the Shah. Rather, Lambton made a case that the vast majority of Iranians hated the Shah and believed he was placed in power by the British. Lambton also developed an intense propaganda against the Shah that was broadcast by BBC. For 3 days, BBC lambasted the Shah for his forcible accumulation of land, forced labor on those properties, lack of democracy, suppressing of the press, manipulation of elections, unlawful arrests and executions, government oppression, poverty, personal enrichment at great public cost, all of which were, of course, true, and all of which, I should say, also paralleled what Radio Berlin was doing in the similar period. Both Bullard and Lambton, though, believed that the Shah abdicated after these BBC broadcasts. Now, had Lambton ended her role as British intelligence officer at this point, she might have gone down in history as a supporter of constitutionalism in Iran, who nevertheless was used by the British Foreign Office at this critical juncture in ways that many scholars of the Middle East, both before and after her, have been used during periods of war and Western occupation of the region. But a decade later, in 1953, Anne Lambton was once again on the scene, and now she used her formidable intelligence and knowledge of Iranian history and politics to push for the opposite, to push for the ouster of the democratic premier of Iran, Muhammad Mossadegh, and she became indeed one of his most vociferous opponents. I'd like to end with a question for Shaul. I'm not sure Shaul can answer my question, but I'm going to give it a try. Do you think Lambton's arguments in 1941 were a genuine sentiment in support of greater democracy in Iran, or only a means to arouse the Iranian public for what was best for the British government, namely the ouster of the Shah? In other words, do you think in 1941 she really thought that by removing Rضاشاه, she was helping the cause of constitutional democracy in Iran? If so, what do we then make of what she did in 1953 when she pushed for the ouster of Mossadegh? Did she turn to the right between 1941 and 53? Or was she all along a cynical and overly ambitious scholar of the Middle East who aspired to greater political power and did as the Foreign Office instructed her to do so? Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Shaul, would you like to take a stab at this question before we turn to Ervand?
Yes, very quickly, let me say that I think Janet is very correct in pointing to the very critical role that Anne Lambton played in Tehran before Rضاشاه's abdication in persuading the ambassador, Sarita Bullard, that Britain's reputation in Iran suffered from its association with Rضاشاه and the belief that they were supportive of Rضاشاه and that he was unpopular. And I really have, since we have no way of estimating public opinion in Iran at the time, we have no way of knowing whether this was correct, that Rضاشاه was as hated as Anne Lambton wrote. As to her change of position in 1953 in the Mossadegh period, I don't think in either case it was a question for her, well, in 1941 of democracy in Iran, or in 1953 for other reasons. Her interest was British interests. And in 1941, like British diplomats at the Foreign Office, she believed that Britain's interest lay in getting rid of Rضاشاه. And in 1953, Mossadegh threatened British interests with the nationalization of the oil industry. And therefore, Anne Lambton also worked to bring about his downfall. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. I'd like to invite Dr. Ervand Abrahamian to comment on the book. Go ahead.
I'm unmuted, okay. Yes, royal families on the whole tend to be interesting because they're invariably dysfunctional. And the Pahlevi is really no exception to this. Now, Shaul's book is focused on Rضاشاه's abdication, obviously, and exile. But I think you get an inkling of the dynamics within the family and how dysfunctional it was. Hopefully someday, maybe Shaul would be tempted to write a book actually on the Pahlevis and the relationship between individuals there. It would provide wonderful material. It wouldn't be like The Crown, but it would compete with that. And I assure you, a program like the film program Mano 2, some of you may not know of it. It's a well-funded Iranian program from California that's main purpose is to create nostalgia for the old regime. I don't think Crown on the Pahlevis would actually do that, but the family provides a very interesting dynamics of what was going on. But what I would like to do is raise two general questions for Shaul, and then end up with sort of a comment that reinforces his conclusion of his book. One question I have that in a way, is intriguing is for most historians, what occurred was pretty much inevitable. That once World War II was there, Iran would be invaded. Once Iran was invaded, the Shah would be forced out, abdicated. So in fact, what happened was very much like a written script from beforehand, and no surprises. But what I found actually surprising in Shah's book is he documents, in fact, so many contingencies, or so many debates about what to do, how to do, solve the problems, that it doesn't become really a railway going on a straight line. There are all sorts of winds and changes in the situation. So my situation would be, without going into a lot of counterfactual history, whether Shah feels that this was really pretty much predetermined what happened, or other things could have happened that would have basically had a different outcome. With Lambton, I agree, Lambton's played this important role, but she's a very complicated personality. In fact, sure, she was adamant about getting rid of Mossadegh, I think for British nationalistic reasons. But if you read her reports in Iran after the coup on the Shah, is some of the most damning reports about the Shah in the 50s, for so much so that the Foreign Office was outraged by some of her conclusions, what she found in Iran after the coup. The second question I have is, I'm intrigued by the contemporary nostalgia for Reza Shah in Iran from very strange places. Now, in many ways, I consider Reza Shah as a very important, significant person in Iranian history, mainly because what he did was he created something that never had occurred in Iran. He created a centralized, strong state. This had never been there in Iran. Often people, and I shall also here, compares him to Ataturk. I think this is actually a misapplication, because Ataturk inherited from the Ottomans a long history of bureaucracy. Iran had no real bureaucracy, had no central army, and what Reza Shah did really from scratch in 20 years created a centralized state. Some people use the word modern. I try to avoid the M word because it's basically soaked up so many different meanings. But I would say his achievement was creation of a modern, not a modern, but a centralized, strong state. And he left that behind. Now, I'm intrigued by this nostalgia, because the last thing Iran needs nowadays is a stronger, more centralized state. So when people are nostalgic for Reza Shah, it seems to be a very misplaced nostalgia or misunderstanding of really Iranian history. So I'd like to hear Shah's explanation why there is this, what it is about Reza Shah that creates this nostalgia. For instance, I would say that Reza Shah is a bit somewhat like Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell or Louis XIII and Richelieu in creating a centralized state. But in France, if people are nostalgic about the past, they're not going to be nostalgic about Richelieu or Henry VIII. That type of nostalgia doesn't apply. Well, I'd like to finally conclude actually on a remark the Shaul has, a very perceptive remark he has, not on Reza Shah, but on Mohammad Reza Shah. And in the disputes about getting his estate back, he describes Mohammad Reza Shah's basically activities as steely determined. And he alludes that this is very different perception that people often have of Mohammad Reza Shah. This is often from the diplomatic reports, especially during the Mossadegh period and then during the Islamic Revolution, that he was like a Hamlet-like figure. He couldn't make up his mind. He wasn't determined. But I actually agree very much with Shaul that this guy was actually very smart, very determined, knew what he was doing. He always said he was not a big, basically, risk taker. But I would describe him as a good poker player who, when he knew he had good cards, he was willing to play for high stakes. When he had a poor hand, he was not willing to risk everything for it. So when you look at his career, from 41 on to the end, there are periods where he is very determined and very successful because he knows he has the right cards and he can get what he wants. It's when he doesn't have the right cards, he's not willing to gamble. And it's these periods when he's not willing to gamble that you find the British and the Americans say, well, he's a Hamlet-like figure, he can't make up his mind. But in his long career, starting from where Shaul begins with fight over the property, you see in the early 40s, he fights tooth and nail to control the armed forces. And any politician who tried to walk into his turf, he was willing to actually destroy them. This happened with Qavam in the early 40s. Also, you see when he, during the Azerbaijan crisis, when he had the right cards, he had American support, he actually ordered the troops into the north over the policies of Qavam again, undermined Qavam. In 1949, after the attempted coup d'etat, attempted assassination, he used that basically crisis to create a constitutive assembly and consolidate his own power. So you see a long periods. Also, of course, in 1963, he was willing to use massive force. So these periods actually reflect very much a very determined person, very much like his father. But it's periods when he didn't have the right cards, especially like during the revolution. He couldn't rely on the army. And here again, he was, I think, more in tune with reality than foreign advisors and even some of his own advisors who kept on saying, oh, you order the army in and they will take care of the situation. He knew his army was not that type of Pinochet type of military that could do that. He was very reluctant to act. But overall, if you look at take his whole career from 41 on, there are, in fact, he survived so long, mainly because he was actually a very shrewd politician and very determined person. In that way, he actually, you can say he continued his father's what Reza Shah had very much done. But in Iran, they often like to compare, contrast the two. So I'd end there. Oh, and one final point, actually, Shaul. In your book, the one person who actually seems very sympathetic, as far as from my point of view, is this guy, Tonking. I wish you'd given more about him. Is there more information about his background? I was even curious about his name. He comes across as someone actually who was very sympathetic to the whole situation. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ervand. Shaul, would you like to comment?
Well, I'll comment briefly on Ervand's points. As to Tonking, the man he mentioned last, he was the man assigned to be Reza Shah's aide in Mauritius, and he continued that role in Johannesburg. And yes, it was his job to take care of Reza Shah and his needs, and to act really a very important role as intermediary between Reza Shah and the British government, and in South Africa between Reza Shah and the South African agreement. No, I'm afraid I don't have more information about him than I put in the book. Regarding was Reza Shah's abdication, let's say his overthrow, inevitable? No, I think not. And as I show in my book, Eden, who played a very important role in bringing about Reza Shah's abdication, had to work very hard to achieve this and considered many different things. For example, he hoped the politicians would invite the British and the Russians to enter Tehran and get rid of Reza Shah. He thought maybe a general would take over. He considered replacing the Pehlوی dynasty with another, with a return of the Qajars altogether. So it was not something that happened without very hard work on Britain's and particularly on Anthony Eden's part. Why the nostalgia now in Iran and among the exiled community for Reza Shah? I really don't think it's that complicated. Iranians remember Reza Shah as a man who modernized Iran. I agree that the term is not very accurate. And here you have an Islamic republic and clerical rulers who to Iranians seem to be taking the country backwards. Reza Shah greatly weakened the clerical power in Iran, and now the clerical power is dominant. And in Reza Shah's time, they believed that Iran was a country that could hold its head high among the international community, and they don't believe that is the case any longer. I quite agree, by the way, with Ervan's evaluation of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, and that he was a far steelier, more adept politician and handler of Iran's foreign policy than he is given credit for. I think the son, since he was always in his father's shadow, would be very pleased to hear Ervan say he was equal to his father in determination and strength. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shaul. Christian, I'm going to turn this to you to moderate questions coming in.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And again, thank you, Dr. Brahimian and Dr. Afari, for wonderful comments, and Shaul for writing this wonderful book. Let me now, after these commentaries, open the discussion up to our audience. You have three ways of entering the conversation. You can use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality and get in the queue. We will call on you, and once we do, please unmute yourself. You'll be asked whether you'd like to mute yourself. Please answer yes, and then you can speak. Or you can use the Q&A function at the top of the Zoom menu and post your question, and I'll read it and convey it to the group. And finally, if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to email Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org with your question or comment. Before as I'm going to the first audience member, let me ask Shaul, by way of opening the question period, could you talk just for a moment about the sources that you've used for this biography? I think in this era of alternative facts, it's good to remind ourselves of the empirical basis, the empirical foundations for historical scholarship. So I'd like, and obviously in Iran's case, there's a big problem in terms of access to some sources. So I would love for you to talk for a moment about the sources you've used for the book and those you couldn't use.
The British archives are very rich, and British diplomats had the good habit for us historians of writing extensive commentaries and dispatches to the Foreign Office. And we have, access to almost all the British archives. For example, regarding Rضاشاه's abdication, I found a handwritten note from Prime Minister Churchill to Anthony Eden just after the occupation of Iran, in which he said to Anthony Eden, "I was glad to hear from you last night that you have no intention of attacking Rضاشاه himself for the moment." So again, to emphasize the abdication was not inevitable. The Iranian sources are more difficult. They're not all available, but some have been published by the Islamic Republic, and there are some memoirs which I was able to use in my book. Unfortunately, I don't know whether they're available or not, but I have no access to the Russian archives. And I asked a friend to look at the German archives for me, and I think whatever is relevant to my book are in there.
Thank you. Let me call on our first audience member, Afshin Matin Asghari. If you could please unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Could you please introduce yourself to the speakers, to the panelists as well? Thank you.
Yes, if you can hear me, my name is Afshin Matin Asghari, and I am a historian of modern Iran, 20th century. I wanted to say that I really appreciated the presentation of the book, and I'm definitely going to read it. Just a short question is what I wrote in the Q&A, and in the range of options that you presented, why couldn't the British, perhaps together with the Soviets, just prevail upon Rضاشاه to let them passage through Iran without the need to overthrow him?
Well, it's really, I think, an interesting question, and I can answer it with an anecdote. When I was doing a postgraduate year at Oxford after finishing college in America, Sir Reader Bullard, the ambassador in Tehran at this time, the British ambassador, gave a talk at St. Anthony's College on his years in Iran. And I asked him whether if Rضاشاه had expelled all the Germans in Iran as the British asked him to, would they still have invaded? And he said, yes, we needed the overland route. And then I asked him whether they had ever told Rضاشاه that the use of Iran's overland route to supply Russia had become crucial to the war effort. And he said, no, they had not done so. So they didn't try really with Rضاشاه to explain their condition and see whether he would agree to violate his own neutrality declaration.
Thank you. Ervan, do you have would you like to respond to this question as well? And Dr. Fari, feel also free to chime in as you see fit.
Yes, I do have another actually anecdote about this issue. I was listening to a lecture by Christopher Hill, the historian of the English Revolution. The lecture was actually on the English Revolution, nothing about Iran. But at some point in his lecture, he was telling his students, you shouldn't believe everything you read in diplomatic documents. And he said, if you look at the document that the Foreign Office produced on the invasion of Iran, you will have many reasons given, but the most important reason given was actually oil, he said. And then he said, how do I know? He said, because I wrote the document. And it turns out he actually was working in the Foreign Office and also relating with the Russian relations because he knew Russian. But what he was pointing out that certain things are not mentioned, but for the British at that time, they needed to make sure that they had security over Khuzestan and oil. And I think probably the route to Russia came as an added reason, but their most important reason was the importance of oil, especially for the Royal Navy. And the way to secure that was to have physical control. But that never went into the documents.
Thank you. I'm very glad to get that on the record. I appreciate that. We'll go next to Rashid Rankine. Sorry for the mispronunciation.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
My name is, again, Rashid Rankin. I am a teacher in New York City and a master's student in history. And so one of my personal interests has always been Iranian history. And I've even written to Dr. Bahash. So one question I really have is, was there any fear of Islamic fundamentalism by international powers in the 1940s? And if there were, was any concern that there would be serious aftershocks of political Islam in Iran and neighboring countries by both the Russians and the English, if you come to think about it? That's it.
Thank you.
I think the answer to that question is quite easy. No, there was no concern that there would be about Islamic fundamentalism emerging in Iran by either Britain or the Soviet Union at that time.
Thank you. Janet and Ervan, let me know if, yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that we need to be aware of the fact that German involvement in Iran in this period was not just economic, it was actually quite significant culturally as well. The Germans, for example, had established a number of schools in Iran, had established a major library in Iran. There were pro-Nazi circles in Iran, some of whom included significant members of the clergy. Actually, it was actually an early Nazi party formed in this very period, 1941 in Iran. And of course, the Iranians had all sorts of reasons to be pro-German, given the long history of the Russians and the British colonial policies in Iran. So Germany had been both very reliable. There was also the German propaganda machine, which was quite formidable. I mean, Radio Berlin had an Iranian, among others, Bahram Shahrukh, who was a master speaker. And there's lots of stories about how many people listened to him in Iran, including Ayatollah Khomeini at the time, who wasn't an Ayatollah yet. So the German propaganda machine was huge, was very important in Iran, and very, very influential in Iran. And this Nazi influence actually continued in Iran. It didn't end with the arrival of the British and Russians in Iran. It continued. We see again a resurrection of it in 1949, 51 actually, when the Sunka Iranian Nazi Party is formed. And we see these Nazis involved in a variety of formations. So I just wanted to bring that in so that we don't think of this as just a question of Russia and Britain, but that Germany was also quite involved.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, a question by Michael S. Goodman. The period in which Shah Reza was living in Johannesburg would have been prior to the beginning of the Afrikaners taking power in 1948. Hence, the racial issue wouldn't have been as much of a concern in his years of exile there? Question mark. Shall we?
well, yes, I mean, I think in the period I covered, but you know, the Prime Minister, Jan Smuts, was willing to accept Rضاشاه as to reside in South Africa. He allowed him to reside in Johannesburg and to be treated as a distinguished visitor, as they called it. So, and as I say, in any case, the color bar did not arise at that time.
Thank you. We have a question by an anonymous attendee. After the abdication of Rضاشاه, was there really a strong support at the people's level for the religious fervor and subsequent support to Ayatollah, considering an enlightened and educated middle class that was there? Were there pro-Soviet communist groups as well? Question mark.
Ervan, you've worked on this more than I have the pro-communist elements. Would you like to take that question?
Yes, of course, the Two-Day Party started in 1941 as soon as the system opened up. In fact, most of the original founders of the party had been in prison under Rضاشاه, and it quickly grew into a mass movement, especially in urban intelligentsia and working class. So by 1946, it was the major force in internal politics. Interestingly enough, actually, if you look at the writings of the Two-Day in this period, it's very much in the tradition of the Iranian constitution. It stresses the ideas of the Enlightenment, individual freedom, and it's very basically sees itself in the tradition of the 1906 revolution. So it appeals across the board among the intellectuals and reformers. And the clergy at that time really did not get involved in politics. There were a few of them, like Kashani, but the main Grand Ayatollah Burujerdi's line was very much that politics were dirty. Clerics should keep their hands clean and not get involved in politics. So that actually became the dominant line among the Rome clerics during this period. Someone asked the question about fundamentalism. Yes, there was a fundamentalist group. It was the Fedayeen Islam that again had started right after 41, and they had a long history of assassinating predominantly intellectuals. And as far as the British and the Americans were concerned, they had no problem with the Fedayeen Islam. In fact, the British Zayner at one point said, well, the Fedayeen Islam is obsessed about women, drink. These are not concerns of the British. We can cooperate with the Fedayeen Islam. And when it came to the actual 53 coup, the CIA was quite willing to cooperate with the Fedayeen Islam in undermining Mossadegh. So both the United States, America and Britain were quite pragmatic about who they used in their political agenda in Iran.
Thank you. Let's go to Herman Cohen. If you could please unmute yourself once called upon.
Yes, I have a question about Iran's relationship with Israel. Did the anti-Israel policy start with the revolution, or did it exist earlier?
Christian, can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it well.
It was hard to hear. Ervan, could you mute your?
Yeah. Okay. The question is, Iran has a very anti-Israel policy today. did it start with the revolution or did it exist earlier?
I can say something about it if you want me to.
Yes.
Sure.
So it's very much tied to the formation of Israel in 1948. And it's tied to the group that we were just talking about, the Fedayeen of Islam. The Fedayeen of Islam and Ayatollah Kashani together made this a major political issue after formation of Israel. So we start to have the beginnings of this in 1948. But of course, it's not a prominent issue. It becomes much later in 1963 when Ayatollah Khomeini makes it a big issue.
Christian, may I add something?
Sure.
But it's also important to point out that the Pehlevis certainly were not anti-Israel, and to begin with, not hostile to the Jewish population in Iran. In fact, I think many Jews thrived in Iran under the Pehlevis in the business community. And we should not forget that his son, Mohammad Rضاشاه, recognized Israel and established relations with it, even though they were not very public.
We can add one more thing, which is when we talk about Rضاشاه and the German and the Nazi period, we should also, as Shaul just said, remember that this was a period when essentially Jews left their ghettos and became much more integrated in Iranian society, attended universities, colleges, joined political parties. So as far as the Jewish community of Iran was concerned, this was actually a very progressive time in Iranian history.
Thank you. Let me call on Alexander Brisker. Please unmute yourself as we call on you. And please introduce yourself to our panelists. Please unmute yourself. You should see an screen pumping up saying unmute yourself and press yes. Okay, here we go. I think we've managed to do that. Please ask your question.
I'm sorry. I don't have a question right now. My child was messing with my phone.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. No problem. Let's go to a question by Stephen Shore, going perhaps a bit beyond the scope of this book. Events of 1953 are commonly referred to as a coup, but wasn't the Shah the chief of state under the Iranian constitution? Shaul, do you want to take that on briefly?
Christian, repeat the question, please.
Sure. Events of 1953 are commonly referred to as a coup, but wasn't the Shah the chief of state under the Iranian constitution?
Well, I certainly don't want to, argue over terms. I mean, the fact is the Shah had left Iran, and I don't think he expected to be back. And we did have both CIA and British intelligence involvement in overthrowing Mossadegh. It could be that in their minds they were overthrowing, bringing back the legitimate ruler of Iran, but these were not events that happened without external intervention.
All right, thank you. Another anonymous attendee is asking, Reza Pahlavi's Mossad was helpless as well, question mark. No Western powers, including the US, helped him. Why?
Again, Christian, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I want
I'm sorry. All right, the question is Reza Pahlavi's Mossad was helpless as well, question mark. No Western powers, including the US, helped him, question mark. Why, question mark.
Rضاشاه's Mossad, was that the question?
That's, yes.
Yes. Well, obviously, once the Allies invaded, the secret police could do nothing about it. And the British actually, on the American side, the British were very anxious to bring the Americans on board and were very careful to inform them of what they were doing and why. And of course, the Americans later sent troops to Iran to help with the resupply of the Soviet Union effort.
Okay, here's a question referring to the reason, the oil. Daniel Jürgen, a knowledgeable oil historian, writes that a critical issue about attacking Iran was to block German advance into the Caucasus and access to the Russian oil in Baku that Hitler was after. It was not for access to Iranian oil. In fact, the output of Iranian oil after the invasion went down considerably because Iranian oil could not be transported through the Mediterranean due to the presence of German military. So Iranian oil was not the reason, the main reason, but the Russian oil was key. I think that responds to an earlier statement by Ervand and Shaul. Would either of you like to comment on that?
Ervand, I'll go first. Well, first of all, the British were very concerned over the German presence in Iran, lest once the war began, Germans in Iran would act as a fifth column, bring about a pro-German government in Tehran, or sabotage oil installations, as well as other important communications lines. And the archives certainly reveal that the German presence was of concern to the Russians because they feared infiltration of German agents into Baku and the threat to the oil fields. But I would say, therefore, both were important, and it's not as if the Iranian oil wasn't, and it continued to be exported and used by the British Navy during the war.
Thank you.
Yes, of course, Britain also had a British Navy that was a worldwide venture. And of course, the British Empire was part of India and so on. So when the British concern was about oil, it wasn't about oil just in London. It was about oil throughout its whole empire. And there's now a myth about England being alone during the war. Of course, when you say that, you're disregarding the whole of the British worldwide empire in 1941-42. So they had larger concerns. If I could go back on the question of the minorities, on the whole, you can say the minorities, Jews, Armenians, Assyrians, Zoroastrians, saw the Rضاشاه period as favorable. But there is actually a problem with that overall. There was a great deal of insecurity because since the whole regime was based on one person, you didn't know what was going to happen the next day. And in fact, towards the end of Rضاشاه's period, I forget it was 1937 or 38, suddenly he turned against the minorities. He closed down the schools. Haim, the head of the Jewish community, either died or was murdered in prison. There was a campaign against the minorities as being criminals. You can see it in the main newspapers. You had a list of pictures of people arrested with clearly Christian names. So this made actually the minorities very insecure. And that explains after 41, so many of the minority intellectuals, in fact, supported the Two-Day Party because they saw that as a sort of a movement that could restrain autocracy.
Thank you. Thanks very much. A question from David Mitch. How did other regional leaders respond to the abdication of the Shah? Also, was communication allowed between leaders and elites within Iran and the exiled Shah? If so, can you comment on the nature of these communications?
Communication between
the Shah and folks in Iran, elites in Iran.
Well, as I said, the British censored Rضاشاه's mail to Iran. And in fact, as I write in my book, one British Foreign Office official said, we don't care what's in the letters from Tehran to Rضاشاه, but they cared greatly that no adverse comment on conditions in Mauritius from the royal family reach Tehran. So there was communication, and now in Tehran, a great many of those letters, family letters between family members, have been published. There was an earlier part to that question.
No, I think you've, let me just see. I think you, how did other regional leaders respond to the abdication of the Shah? Yes.
I really do not know. Is anyone, Janet or Ervant, can speak to that?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
How did other regional leaders react to the abdication of the Shah?
Yeah, no, I'm not someone to comment on that.
Okay, well, we can go to the next question. Question by John Limbert, great presentation by all, exclamation mark. What do we know about the Russian view of removing Rضاشاه? So that continues in that line of questioning. Did the British have to convince them?
My impression is that the British, once Hitler invaded Russia, it's interesting how quickly Eden and I imagine Churchill took on the Russians as allies. And my impression in Iran, at least, is they worked very closely together.
Thank you. Jessica, I'm sorry, Ervant, did you want to chime in?
Yes, my reading of the British documents was that what actually finally really rushed Rضاشاه to abdicate was when he heard that the Red Army was actually going to march into Tehran. So that, in a way, the British and the Russians played the good cop, bad cop, and I think the Rضاشاه had an inherent fear of the northern neighbor, and he knew the British were going to basically treat him like a gentleman, and the Russians would have been, in fact, by then less gentlemanly. And they may have known certain things that often we ignore. I was surprised to find that in the late 1930s, Rضاشاه wanted to buy British bombers from a modern type of bombers. And the reason he gave was it would be easy for him to bomb Baku. So if the Russians had known this, they would have had additional reasons for wanting to act strongly against Rضاشاه.
Also, I mean, he had been a member of the Cossack Brigade. He was from the north. He was from Gilan and Mazandaran. He knew the Russians very, very well. He had seen the experience of the Gilan Republic. He had put that down. he knew that the Russians, well, occupied Iran till after 1917. So this fear of Russian occupation of Iran was a huge fear looming in the back of his mind, as rightly. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, the Soviets, when they came inside Iran during World War II, they didn't want to leave. So there was a real fear.
Thank you. Jessica Walpert asks the question, was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi always the first choice to succeed his father? I've read that the British wanted a Qajar prince. Were there other choices that they preferred over Reza Shah's son?
Yes, I deal with that in a chapter in my book. Theo Avery, the British Secretary of State for India, was very persistent in advocating for a Qajar prince, the dynasty that Reza Shah had overthrown, and the brother of the last Qajar Shah of Iran, as a better king for England than Reza Shah. And when he first proposed this, both the Foreign Secretary Eden and other members of the Foreign Office thought this a very well, they dismissed this proposal, but his persistence in the end paid off. Added to the insistence of Bullard, the ambassador in Tehran, that Reza Shah's unpopularity was hurting the British, and the belief that the son would not be a strong ruler led finally the Foreign Office to consider briefly returning this proposal to return the Qajars to power, a really fantasy notion, which didn't occur. And also because they were considering alternatives. Yes, I mean, Bullard, the ambassador in Tehran, was hearing all sorts of suggestions about other members of the Pahlevi royal family who would make supposedly a better king than Mohammad Reza Shah. All of this, let us say, came to naught, and the eldest son succeeded to the throne.
Thank you. A final question, I think it has to be the final question since we're just about out of time, by Tom Parker from George Washington University. What lessons did Reza Shah draw from his father's experience?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't think we know for certain, but certainly, you know, he saw foreign powers, the British and the Russians, overthrow his father. And I think in 1953, he again experienced British and in this case, American intervention to regain the throne for him under Mossadegh. So I think both experiences, and yes, the first one too, left an impression. And I imagine, although I cannot, as they say this with any certainty or real knowledge, that during the Islamic Revolution, the uprising in 1978-79, he may also have imagined or hoped that the Allies would intervene again to save the throne for him. The third time round, it didn't happen.
Thank you. Well, I think we're at the end of our discussion. With thanks to Shaul, Ervand, Janet, and Marissa, we'll give Eric the final word. Eric, over to you.
And thank you, Christian, as well as those of you in the audience, and apologies to those whose questions we could not get to. There were a good number of them today. We would invite you to join us back next Monday, March 22nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we return to discuss the politics of mass violence in the Middle East with Laura Robeson. Good night and take care.